The following is a presentation of The 12 Jokes Your Therapist Should Tell You by Chad H. Beaver, marriage and family therapist. Chapter 1, The Monster Under the Bed. A guy goes to a psychiatrist because he can't sleep. He's afraid there is a monster under the bed. For months he sees the doctor and they try different tests and diagnosis and many different medications and still the guy can't sleep. He's afraid of the monster under the bed. One day the man decides to stop going to the psychiatrist, saying none of this crap is working. 2 weeks later the man runs into the doctor at the grocery store. The doctor looks at him and says, "My goodness man, you look well rested, what happened?" The man says, "I went to a therapist and he fixed it in one session." The doctor asks, "He fixed it in one session, what did he say?" "He said cut the legs off the bed." This has been the first story I tell clients for more than 10 years. I've always preempted it by stating this is the way I work and the way I'm going to view our relationship. This story conveys many of the ideas that I've come to believe are true in the world of mental health. Many times the fears we have are often alleviated by simple changes in our routines and environments. Finding those little changes are the triggers that help us gain traction on life's highway. The man's fear of the monster under the bed was obviously an irrational thought. Who knows why it was brought on, and oftentimes we will not understand what makes them go away. Why did the monster not simply move to the closet? But when we take a medical approach to these issues, we can get mired down in an attempt to put a rational spin on a rational belief, as the doctor did with his many diagnoses and medications. Over the last 20 years as a therapist, I have seen so much harm caused by misdiagnosis and medication that I believe firmly that this method of treatment should never be the first plan of action. I've seen children medicated to the point of drooling and given crippling diagnosis that prevents them from being able to develop a secure and positive self-image. In the first session, this joke is one of the most important steps to treatment. If a person can look at this story and see that approaching from a different aspect is often the keystone to changing perspective, then cognitive challenging can begin. The therapist did in no way discredit or assume the man had a disease or disorder, and by using a hands-on solution gave peace of mind. I've seen this approach have amazing real-world results and have seen this simple perspective change people's lives. A personal experience I have had with this approach involved a severe case of delusions and how putting soup in a bowl overcame. I was working on the west coast of Washington state and met a young lady who was having a severe mental break. She was having severe delusions about the end of the world and was unable to function on a daily basis. After several sessions I discussed with her the values of changing what your hands do and changing mindset. I said go down to the local nursing home and volunteer. For the next few sessions, I would make sure to follow up and ask if she had done the task assigned to her, and of course she never did. Then one day she didn't return to session, and it was about 4 months before I saw her again. I remember walking through the lobby of our clinic and having to do a double take at a well-dressed and groomed lady sitting there. She asked if I had a few minutes and explained how she had finally gone down to the nursing home after our last session. She volunteered there 2 days and was hired as a caregiver for a local couple. She was now sleeping and eating well, on a regular routine of work and home, and was stable. From that moment on, volunteering has been a regular recommendation in my therapy sessions. That change in mindset and finding a purpose is a vital part of changing our mental status. Finding a positive out for us to showcase what we are able to do is one of the only ways to truly change who we are. So often I've seen the act of labeling and limiting become disabling. I found a research article about this very phenomenon. It's a story about a man named Bob. A group of researchers were observing Bob and one day decided to have every person that met Bob on his way into his office ask if he was all right, and state he looked sick. As Bob got out of his car, he was met in the parking lot by a colleague who asked if he was feeling okay and told him he looked kind of sick. Now, at this time, Bob told his friend he felt fine and was having a good day, but as he entered the building, the secretary of the building asked the same questions of Bob. So on throughout the morning, Bob was asked if he felt okay. And after this was repeated several times, by lunch, Bob went home sick. This study was done to demonstrate the power of labels and psychosomatic effects that can happen when we are labeled sick. This story of Bob is a common effect that is seen in the mental health field. Oftentimes people are labeled with diseases such as bipolar and ADHD, when in fact they simply are being told they are different, and the label oftentimes leads the way to medications and treatment that may not be correct for the individual. The problem with this is a simple fact though: we unfortunately do not know a lot about what constitutes mental disease. At this point there are no tests that can be run to show a mental illness, at least no ones widely available to the public. So we base these diagnoses on what pattern of behavior we see and what we consider normal. That term normal itself is a very loaded word here. Ultimately you put your life in the hands of someone that is going to label you based on what they consider normal. The DSM-5 has a lot of diagnosis and limitations it sets, that if you fall outside those limits it is abnormal. However, even since its publication just recently, changes are being made to consider more cultural behaviors and expand the limits beyond the traditional sense of normalcy. In the early days of mental health, the limits of normalcy were very strict, and even behaviors, such as vagrancy and homosexuality, were considered mental illness, and often people were locked up in asylums. In 1972 the Supreme Court signed the Wyatt Act, that ultimately led to people no longer being locked up for life in asylums. This act prevents excessive holding times for people with mental health issues, and which no longer allows families to drop off unwanted family members for long-term care. So as we consider what is normal as being decided by a system that not more than a generation ago treated even minor behavior issues with severe consequences and torturous and traumatic treatment. Keep in mind that the system itself is evolving to a more tolerant and open-minded process, but it still has a damn long way to go. Be careful adopting and accepting labels that even your lowliest of therapists may use. It does not define you unless you let it. Consider the evolutionary status of the concept of diagnosis, and how these criteria change regularly, and how just thinking we are a certain way we tend to act a certain way. Now consider how quickly we move towards medications to fix the way we act. Think of the dangers of chemical interactions to change our brains. If we again stop to admit science has very little understanding of the brain and how and why it responds the way it does to situations and substances, then we see the danger in just randomly throwing chemicals at it to change a behavior, is like fishing with dynamite. Yes, you may get the fish you are after, but you're going to kill a lot more fish too. I tell clients, if you ever hear someone say depression is a chemical imbalance, grab your shit and run. The brain chemicals dopamine and serotonin have become daily talk show words and have been the focus of big pharmacy companies for decades. In the brain these chemicals work more like this. If tomorrow you get up and have to go to a funeral and they measure the dopamine and serotonin levels in your brain, they would be low. However, the next day you get up and go to Disneyland and they measure the same two chemicals, they would be high. So what caused the depression and what caused the euphoria? It wasn't a change in chemicals, it was a change in situations. In therapy we use what is called the feelings thought behavior chain. This states that every behavior we have is based on a thought or series of thoughts we have, and those thoughts are based on underlying feelings and how we interpret them. Psychiatry focuses on changing the feelings, to change the thought, and thus, change the behavior, i.e. if this drug makes you feel better you will change how you behave. Therapy on the other hand should focus on the FTB chain going the other direction. If change what you are doing you will change how you think and feel. Or as I tell clients, if you get your hands busy, your mind will focus on what your hands are doing and then you'll feel better. Now go rent a jet ski, cause I've never seen anybody crying and riding a jet ski. Finally, the punchline of the joke. Cut the legs off the bed. Going to therapy should be a time-limited event. Many models of treatment actually set a limit of no more than 12 sessions for a therapist to work with a client. This is to help with the treatment process. Setting the timeline puts responsibility on the client to change, and therapist to provide the tools to change. If in that set time limit they can't cut the legs off the bed and resolve the issue, the therapist should refer the client and admit a lack of knowledge in this area, giving the therapist a subject to study, grow, and learn. In this model, the therapist and client both have a growth mindset with a set timeline. This is much different than the take this pill for the rest of your life mentality often seen in the medical side of mental health. Please don't misunderstand that often a client and therapist relationship will last years, and you build trust and gain confidence in each other. However, you should be seeing progress that is identifiable, and the therapist must know his or her limits. I hope this has given clients a brief outline of how treatment is supposed to work in the job of both the client and the therapist. I'll tell you to cut the legs off the bed. Your job is to cut the legs and let go of the monster.